When 10-year-old Lily Thompson first steps through the entrance of a foreboding orphanage, the question that escapes her lips sends a ripple of unease through the staff's spine. What seemed like a simple search for a new home at first takes a sinister turn as the pieces unravel, revealing a dark truth, one that puts her life and the lives of those around her in unimaginable danger. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Lily arrived at Rosewood Orphanage in the late afternoon, the sky overhead choked with gray clouds that rumbled quietly with the promise of rain. She clutched a small suitcase in one hand and a wrinkled envelope in the other. The social worker who had driven her in a rattling old sedan was gone, leaving her to face the looming gates alone. Towering iron bars and a rust-speckled sign reading Rosewood Orphanage made her heart pound. A raw wind hissed through the nearby trees, scattering brown leaves around her ankles. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so overwhelmed. Her mother's passing was still fresh, her sorrow unresolved. This orphanage was supposed to be her new start, but something about its tall spires and dark windows unsettled her. She took a breath that trembled in her chest. She was too young to articulate exactly why the place made her uneasy. The building itself seemed to glare down at her, its roof peaked like a watchful crow, the windows on the top floor shuttered. A tangle of vines had claimed the stone walls, twisting up from the foundation to the second-story sills. It didn't match her idea of a comforting home in the slightest. Yet she had nowhere else to go. No family wanted to take her in, there were no close relatives left. A pang of loneliness squeezed her heart. From behind those intimidating gates emerged a slender woman in a sensible gray dress, her brown hair swept into a severe bun. She unlocked the iron barrier, hinges moaning in protest. "You must be Lily Thompson," the woman said in a smooth voice. "I'm Miss Rowan, the headmistress here." Lily nodded, her throat tightening with a mix of anxiety and lingering grief. She wanted to sound polite, to say something like, "Thank you for taking me," but the words jammed in her throat. She managed only a faint smile, hugging her suitcase closer. Miss Rowan regarded Lily with a small, measured nod. "Come in," she said. "We've been expecting you." Expecting her. That phrase sounded too cold, too businesslike, as if Lily were a package delivered to the wrong address. Still, she reminded herself that she should be grateful that someone was willing to give her a roof and a bed. With an effort of will, she followed Miss Rowan onto the orphanage grounds. The path was lined with leafless rosebushes, their thorny branches snagging at Lily's coat. She thought it odd how not a single bloom dared show itself. Soon, Miss Rowan guided Lily into a cavernous foyer with checkerboard tiles. The air was stale, carrying a hint of cleaning solution overlain with something musty. A single chandelier, dangling precariously from the ceiling, provided dim yellow light. Lily glanced around at the portraits on the walls, stern-looking individuals with austere expressions. She shivered, feeling as though their painted eyes followed her. "This way," Miss Rowan said, leading her down a corridor. "I'll show you to your dormitory." They passed several closed doors, each bearing a faded brass plaque. Lily picked up faint murmurs from behind them, quiet whispers, a muffled sob, or maybe her imagination. She felt a stab of homesickness for the small apartment she once shared with her mother, for the pot of soup always bubbling on the stove and her mother's soft voice reading bedtime stories. Now, all of that was gone, replaced by this cold hush. Upon reaching a long dorm room lined with narrow beds, Miss Rowan stopped. About a dozen girls, ranging from ages 7 to 13, turned their heads to stare. One or two offered tentative smiles, but most just observed with blank curiosity. The bed at the far end was empty, sheets folded in a neat square. "Put your suitcase there," Miss Rowan instructed, pointing. "Dinner is at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll miss your meal." She paused, leveling Lily with an unreadable gaze. "We have rules, Lily, and we expect everyone to follow them. If you have questions, you may ask me, but do try to settle in quickly." With that, Miss Rowan pivoted and strode out, leaving Lily to stand amid the strangers. The older girls resumed hushed conversations, while younger ones returned to whatever quiet activities occupied them. Lily gulped, crossing to her assigned bed. She felt awkward, as though any misstep might draw disapproval from Miss Rowan or from these unknown children. Carefully, she laid her tattered suitcase at the foot of the bed, set her envelope inside it for safekeeping, and sank onto the mattress. That was when she noticed another girl in the dorm, about 13 or 14, kneeling by her own bed, tears slipping down her cheeks as she stuffed clothes into a small bag. The girl's name, Lily would learn, was Amelia. Their eyes met briefly, and Amelia's expression twisted with a silent plea, as if she wanted to say something but dared not. She zipped her bag with trembling fingers, then sat there, shoulders trembling, staring at the floor. Lily felt a pang of concern. Should she offer to help? But the fear in Amelia's eyes spoke volumes, warning Lily to keep her distance. Lily tried to focus on unpacking her few belongings: a folded photograph of her mother, a worn sweater, a children's chapter book her mother once read to her. She just finished laying them out on the threadbare blanket when a staff member appeared in the doorway. The staffer, wearing a stiff uniform of some sort, beckoned. "Time for dinner," she called, her voice echoing in the dorm. The girls lined up with practiced efficiency. Lily slid into place, head bowed, though she couldn't resist glancing back at Amelia. The older girl looked panicked, as if dinner was the last thing on her mind, but she fell in line anyway, discreetly wiping tears from her cheeks. The dining hall was large, lined with long wooden tables. Kids were grouped in rows, each seat occupied except for a few open spots. Lily followed the others, gathering a metal tray of lukewarm stew, lumpy mashed potatoes, and a slice of stale bread. The staff patrolled the edges of the hall like watchful hawks. Miss Rowan stood by the far end, smiling with an odd tightness. At first glance, the meal seemed ordinary enough, like any institutional setting. But as Lily ate her bland stew, her gaze drifted around, noticing how subdued everyone seemed. There was no chatter or laughter typical of children. Instead, quiet tension reigned, broken only by the occasional scrape of a spoon. Partway through dinner, Lily saw Amelia slip out of her seat, tray barely touched. She walked toward the exit with hurried steps. A staff member intercepted her, leaning in to say something Lily couldn't hear. Amelia answered, voice trembling, "I'm sorry, but I'm not feeling well." The staffer frowned, letting her pass only after a long, suspicious stare. Alarm curled inside Lily like a stray gust of icy wind. Something about Amelia's desperation was unmistakable. The older girl was either frightened or in danger, and Lily had no clue how to help. After dinner, Lily returned to the dorm, hoping to speak with Amelia. But the bunk where Amelia slept was empty, the suitcase with clothes gone. Lily searched quietly, glancing around corners, but there was no sign of her. She soon realized she'd have to keep her eyes and ears open if she wanted to understand what was really happening here. By the time Lily climbed into bed that night, a storm had begun outside. Lightning flashed beyond the dormitory windows, throwing jagged silhouettes across the walls. Thunder growled overhead, and the wind rattled the panes. Lily pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders, longing for her mother's old knitted quilt. She felt more alone than ever, in a place that crackled with secrets. Even the bunk felt cold and unwelcoming. Half asleep, she woke to footsteps in the hall around midnight. The door creaked open. Lily lifted her head to see Amelia creeping in, eyes swollen from tears. She was retrieving something from under her mattress, a small stuffed toy? Lily couldn't quite make it out in the darkness. Fear painted Amelia's face. She looked ready to bolt again, but upon noticing Lily's gaze, she froze. For a second, neither spoke. Then Amelia shook her head as if telling Lily not to interfere, and tiptoed out into the corridor once more. Heart pounding, Lily considered following her. But she was too timid, too unsure. Minutes later, she heard muffled voices in the hallway, then silence. She lay awake, anxiety gnawing at her, until dawn light crept through the window. In the morning, she discovered Amelia's bed neatly made, her trunk emptied of clothes, completely vanished. When Lily questioned the staff, they offered polite smiles and insisted Amelia was adopted by a wonderful family who came at sunrise. They offered no further details. But I saw her so upset last night, Lily protested. Why would? The staff brushed off her concerns. Children get emotional, one of them said breezily. It was all arranged. There's nothing to worry about. Yet Lily couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. She recalled Amelia's tearful expression, the hushed tones in the corridor. Adopted families usually arrived during normal hours, greeted the child, signed papers. Why whisk a girl away in the dead of night with no goodbye to anyone? The pit in Lily's stomach grew heavier. That day, Lily was assigned a chore in the kitchen, a dull task of peeling potatoes. Another child joined her, a boy with sandy hair and anxious brown eyes. He introduced himself in hushed tones, glancing around to ensure no staff stood nearby. I'm Matthew, he murmured. I saw you watching Amelia last night. Lily's pulse kicked. Do you know what happened to her? Matthew darted his eyes around, then leaned closer, voice low. She's not the first. They say she got adopted, but no one ever hears from kids like that again. A cold wave of realization coursed through Lily. She put down the potato. So it's not normal? Matthew shook his head. No. People vanish. The staff says it's adoptions, but some of us suspect it's not so simple. My friend Toby disappeared last month, and he left all his belongings behind. He never wrote back like he promised. Goosebumps prickled Lily's arms. She felt a surge of alarm, but also a flicker of resolve. We have to find out the truth, she whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. We can't just let people vanish. Matthew nodded grimly. Yeah, but we have to be careful. Miss Rowan doesn't like questions. I asked about Toby once, and I got kitchen duty for a week. Plus, I'm pretty sure she's watching me now. Later that evening, Lily observed Miss Rowan in the hallway, speaking with a tall, severe-looking man wearing a dark suit. Mr. Denfield, she would learn. He was rarely on the premises, but apparently he oversaw finances. They spoke in low, clipped voices. Lily caught fragments: transfer fees, timing, shipment. The words turned her stomach. She had the sense that children were being discussed like commodities. When Lily tried telling one of the older girls about her suspicions, the girl stiffened, face blanching. Don't get involved, she hissed, fear in her eyes. If you poke too much, they'll come for you too. Then she walked away, leaving Lily with a growing sense of dread. Despite her anxiety, Lily found herself determined to keep an eye out. She began scribbling notes in a small, battered notebook her mother once gave her. She recorded details of each child who disappeared: name, approximate age, the night they vanished. She jotted down overheard snippets from staff. She felt like a spy in a sinister realm, terrified but resolute. She couldn't just ignore the strange happenings. One morning, while assisting with chores in the orphanage office, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets, Lily stumbled upon a battered folder stamped "Transferred." The papers within described a child's profile, along with vague references to funds received. No adoptive family details, no address. Her heart thudded. She recalled hearing that word from Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield. She gingerly flipped a page, seeing a name she recognized from the dorm, a girl who vanished 2 weeks prior. Next to it, typed, "Transferred. Payment cleared." The rest was a swirl of abbreviations Lily didn't understand. Fear jolted her so hard she nearly dropped the folder. This was tangible proof that the vanishings weren't normal adoptions. She quickly stuffed the papers back into place, terrified that if Miss Rowan found her snooping, she'd end up on some transfer list herself. Sure enough, mere seconds later, the office door opened, and in walked Miss Rowan. Lily forced a casual demeanor, dusting a shelf as though that were her only mission. "I trust you're almost finished," Miss Rowan said, her tone cordial but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. Her gaze lingered on Lily, making her heart pound. "Yes, Miss Rowan," Lily replied, carefully stepping away from the filing cabinet. She clutched her cleaning rag, trying not to show how rattled she felt. Miss Rowan offered a curt nod. "Good. We have high expectations for every resident here, Lily. Obedience. Respect. I do hope you'll remember that." Lily bobbed her head, swallowing hard. "I will." That night, Lily confided in Matthew. They huddled in a corner of the courtyard, half hidden by an old fountain that no longer ran. The sky overhead was a dull slate, tinged with flickers of starlight. Lily whispered everything she'd seen, the folder labeled, transferred, the cryptic notes about payment. Matthew's face grew pale. "I was afraid it might be something like that," he said, voice trembling. "It's not real adoption, is it? They're selling kids." Lily's stomach twisted. She remembered Amelia's tear-stricken face, the hush in the dorm when children left in the dead of night. "We have to do something," she insisted, though her fear churned. "But who would believe us? The staff is all complicit. We can't contact the outside without permission." Matthew grimaced, worry etched in every line of his face. "We might need proof," he said. "Like actual documents or pictures. Something we can give the police." "We need to gather evidence," Lily agreed. Her mind spun. "But I'm just a kid." "You're a kid. Who'll listen to us?" A flicker of determination lit Matthew's eyes. "Maybe there's someone who visits who's not part of this. An outsider. We can show them." The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. Lily continued taking notes in her secret notebook, hiding it under a loose floorboard beneath her bunk. She noticed Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield meeting more frequently in quiet corners, discussing logistics. The tension around the orphanage grew heavier. Staff were quicker to reprimand children who lingered in the halls. Doors were locked earlier, and roll calls happened more often. Lily felt the net tightening. One afternoon, she found a potential ally, Mrs. Bloom, an elderly volunteer librarian who visited once a week to sort donated books. Mrs. Bloom had kind eyes and a gentle manner, far different from the brisk hardness of the regular staff. Lily hesitated, but her desperation overwhelmed her caution. While helping Mrs. Bloom shelve dictionaries, Lily murmured, "Mrs. Bloom, I think something bad is going on here." Mrs. Bloom paused, brow furrowing. She glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "Why do you say that, dear?" Lily's heart hammered. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Children vanish at night. The staff claims they're adopted, but I've seen paperwork that suggests they're being sold. Or trafficked. I don't know exactly. But it's not normal." A flash of shock crossed Mrs. Bloom's features. She set down a heavy volume, her hands trembling. "That's a serious accusation, Lily. Are you certain?" "I am," Lily whispered. "Look, I know it sounds impossible, but I've kept notes. And my friend Matthew saw things too." Mrs. Bloom's eyes flicked with concern. "Have you tried speaking to any authorities?" Lily shook her head, tears threatening. "We're not allowed to leave. We have no way to call. They monitor everything. Please, Mrs. Bloom, you have to believe me." Softening, Mrs. Bloom placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "I believe you feel something is very wrong. I'll see what I can do. I know someone at the local police station, Officer Rita Morgan. She's an old friend. But I can't just barge in with rumors. We might need actual evidence." Lily swallowed, remembering the folder, the cryptic notes, Amelia's disappearance. "I can try to gather more proof," she said. "If you can get me a camera or something, I might be able to show you the basement or the files." Mrs. Bloom's face creased with worry. "That's dangerous, Lily. If what you say is true, Miss Rowan and the staff won't hesitate to punish you. Are you sure you want to take that risk?" Lily thought of the terrified faces of those who vanished. Amelia's teary exit, Toby's quiet departure. "I have to," she said, voice trembling with conviction. "I can't just watch kids disappear." Moved by the determination in Lily's eyes, Mrs. Bloom nodded slowly. "All right," she murmured, voice soft. "I'll bring a small camera next time I come. But please be careful. And hide it well. Once we have photos, I can try to show them to Officer Morgan." Lily exhaled in relief, tears brimming. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Over the next week, Lily and Matthew plotted their approach in hurried whispers. They learned from overhearing staff that the basement had a locked steel door behind a row of old donation boxes. They suspected that was where the more incriminating records and possibly other horrors were hidden. Lily quaked at the thought, but if she wanted to prove what was happening, she had no choice but to go there. They decided to wait for Mrs. Bloom's next visit so they could snap photos. That meant days of biding their time, ignoring Miss Rowan's suspicious stares, and praying no other child vanished in the interim. But the vanishings continued. A boy named Curtis disappeared one evening, apparently adopted by a family who arrived at midnight, according to staff. Lily overheard a staffer mention that the transfer fees arrived on time. The entire conversation made her skin crawl. She scribbled more notes, half dreading what might happen if the staff discovered her scribbles. She began to have nightmares of locked doors and stern faces, waking in cold sweats. At last, Mrs. Bloom returned. She and Lily found a moment alone by the library shelves. "I brought this," Mrs. Bloom whispered, surreptitiously passing a small disposable camera into Lily's hand. "There are only a few shots in it, so make them count. And keep it hidden." Lily's heart hammered as she tucked the camera into the waistband of her skirt, hiding it under her blouse. "I will," she breathed. "Thank you." That night, Lily and Matthew put their plan into action. They waited until long after curfew, when the staff made their final rounds. Once sure the corridors were clear, Lily slipped out of her bunk, carefully retrieving the camera. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she steeled herself, creeping past the sleeping girls. Matthew met her near the stairwell, a nervous glint in his eyes. "Ready?" Lily whispered. Matthew swallowed, nodding. "Yeah. Let's do this." They tiptoed down a hallway that smelled of floor polish and something sour. Each step seemed to echo too loudly, so they paused whenever the old boards creaked. At last, they reached the double doors leading to the basement corridor. A heavy padlock barred the way. Lily produced a small metal nail file she'd stolen from the bathroom. Her hands shook as she attempted to jimmy the lock, recalling how she'd once seen a character in a detective show do something similar. It was clumsy, and more than once she feared the rattling might alert staff. But after what felt like an eternity, the lock snapped open. "Good job," Matthew breathed, relief flickering in his eyes. They slipped through the doors and descended a flight of stone steps. The air grew colder, smelling of damp concrete and old pipes. The faint glow of a distant bulb illuminated their path, flickering like a dying firefly. Lily clutched the camera, praying it would work despite its cheap plastic lens. The corridor was lined with old cabinets and boxes labeled donations. Farther down, half hidden by crates, a solid metal door loomed. A large bolt and a keyed lock secured it. Lily's chest tightened. They tried the nail file again. The lock was more robust this time, but after several tense minutes and muffled exclamations of frustration, it clicked open. Lily felt sweat trickle down her temples, though the basement air was chilly. With a gentle push, the door creaked inward, revealing a small room flickering with fluorescent light. Immediately, Lily's senses were assaulted by the sharp smell of disinfectant. She stepped inside, trembling. The room was more like a medical lab than a storage area. Cabinets of labeled vials lined one wall, alongside trays of syringes and medical gloves. In a corner stood several metal cots, each with restraints dangling from the sides. The sight made Lily's blood run cold. She shot a terrified glance at Matthew, who looked as though he might be sick. "What is this?" Lily whispered. "Why would an orphanage need this stuff?" Matthew's gaze swept the room, lingering on a stack of folders scattered across a metal table. "Look there," he said, pointing. Lily approached, camera in hand. The topmost folder bore the name of a child she recognized, someone who disappeared weeks ago. Next to "transferred," Lily saw typed references to large sums of money, delivery arranged, and a signature from someone she didn't recognize. Heart-pounding, she snapped pictures of the folder, of the medical equipment, of the cots. Another moment, and Lily discovered a locked cabinet labeled "Financials." She tried to pry it open, but it was sealed tightly. She settled for taking pictures of the label, figuring it might help prove something. A sound echoed from the corridor outside, footsteps, growing louder. Panic flashed between Lily and Matthew. They killed the light, ducking behind a metal shelf. The footsteps paused at the door. Lily's lungs squeezed, terror swallowing her. If they were caught here, they'd be done for. A faint beep, and the door swung open. Light flooded in as Miss Rowan stepped inside, followed by Mr. Denfield. They wore grim expressions. Lily's heart thundered. Matthew gripped her arm. They huddled, praying the stacked crates would shield them from sight. "I'm telling you," Miss Rowan hissed, "someone's been snooping. I found the basement door unlocked last night. We need to move the next transfer up before word gets out. The buyer is already impatient." Mr. Denfield's voice was cold. "We can't rush. We still have to handle the new arrivals carefully." He sifted through the folders on the table. "If the staff, or worse, an outsider starts suspecting, we'll lose everything." Miss Rowan gave a bitter chuckle. "No one will suspect. They believe our sweet orphanage facade. But we must keep a close watch on that new girl, Lily. She's been far too curious." Lily's pulse skittered. She pressed herself lower, quelling a whimper. Matthew's eyes gleamed with fear. They realized Miss Rowan suspected Lily was the snoop. If they didn't get out soon, they might be forcibly transferred, like the others. After rummaging through the documents, Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield left, locking the door behind them. Lily and Matthew were trapped, darkness enclosing them. Lily fought down panic. She flicked on her flashlight, a small penlight Matthew had smuggled from a supply closet. They scanned the walls, seeking another exit. At the far corner, behind a row of crates, was a narrow ventilation shaft. Lily tugged at the grate, her breath ragged. The screws were loose enough that a few forceful tugs freed it. She gestured for Matthew to boost her up. One by one, they wriggled into the metal duct. It was cramped, metal edges digging into Lily's arms. She crawled forward, ignoring the cobwebs brushing her face, guided only by the faint glow of the penlight. Behind her, Matthew shuffled, every movement echoing in the tin shaft. Eventually, a rush of cold air signaled an opening. They peered out onto the orphanage grounds, behind an overgrown hedge. Freezing night air hit Lily's face as she tumbled out, clinging to the camera. Matthew followed, panting with relief. They crouched behind the hedge, heartbeats wild. The orchard beyond was bathed in moonlight, and the orphanage's walls loomed. They saw no immediate sign of staff, so they hurried back in through a side entrance Lily knew was often left unlatched. Slipping up the stairs and into their dorms, they parted ways silently, each climbing into bed. Lily clenched the camera to her chest beneath the blankets, mind spinning with adrenaline. She had pictures. Evidence. But what would happen when Miss Rowan discovered the break-in? Morning brought swirling fear. Lily carefully hid the camera deep inside her mattress. She tried to appear calm, but a hollowness gnawed at her stomach. Sure enough, staff searched the dorm after breakfast, rummaging through trunks, under beds, behind dressers, looking for contraband. Lily barely dared to breathe as they patted down her mattress. Mercifully, they didn't find the small slit she'd made. She cast a sidelong glance at Matthew, who was tense but outwardly stoic. The staff eventually left, whispering among themselves that the intruder must be somewhere else. By lunchtime, word spread that Miss Rowan was on the warpath. She dragged Lily aside, confronting her in a hallway. "You," she said, voice clipped. "You've been snooping. Where were you last night?" Lily's heart hammered. I was in my bunk," she stammered, eyes lowered. "I didn't go anywhere." Miss Rowan glared with eerie calm. "If I find proof otherwise, you'll regret it." She leaned in, voice dripping with warning. "You might fancy yourself a detective, but children who cause trouble here have a way of disappearing." Lily swallowed hard. I understand." After that, Lily felt staff eyes on her every moment. She avoided moving alone, often staying near Harriet, a timid girl who was too frightened even to talk about the vanishings. Harriet cast Lily worried looks, occasionally whispering, "Be careful. I don't want them to take you away too." Lily tried to project false confidence, but panic churned inside her. She hadn't even told Harriet about the camera for fear Harriet might slip up under pressure. The day Mrs. Bloom next arrived, Lily seized a brief moment while returning a pile of books. She guided Mrs. Bloom behind a tall bookshelf, heart fluttering. "I have them," Lily murmured, pulling out the camera from under her shirt. "Photos of the basement. The equipment. The records." Mrs. Bloom's breath caught. "Oh, Lily." She accepted the camera gently. This is so brave of you, but also so dangerous. I'll show these to Officer Morgan. Lily's anxiety spilled out. Please hurry, she whispered. They suspect me. I'm scared they'll do something soon. Mrs. Bloom touched Lily's shoulder. I'll do everything I can, she promised. I should be able to meet Officer Morgan tomorrow. We'll keep you safe. That promise buoyed Lily's spirits, but in the orphanage's stifling environment, hope was fragile. She avoided Miss Rowan's gaze, but each passing hour felt heavier. Then, one evening, catastrophe struck. Matthew vanished. He had spoken to Lily at dinner about feeling watched, and he feared that staff might come for him, but Lily never imagined they'd move so quickly. By dawn, his bunk was stripped bare, the pillow tossed aside. Lily's stomach lurched with grief and terror. She ran to Harriet, tears in her eyes. He's gone, she whispered, voice cracking. They took him. He was so scared. Harriet trembled. I heard noises in the night, footsteps. I was too afraid to look. She sniffled, tears welling. What do we do now? Lily felt something break inside her. She tried to gather evidence, tried to show Mrs. Bloom, but it wasn't fast enough to save Matthew. Her fear morphed into a fierce resolve. Mrs. Bloom must have shown the photos to the police, Lily said, swallowing. They have to help us. We can't let them take more kids. The day dragged on. Lily half expected to see squad cars pull up or official men in suits storm the orphanage, but nothing came. She despaired, wondering if the police didn't believe Mrs. Bloom's claims. Late in the afternoon, Harriet caught Lily's arm. Mrs. Bloom is here, Harriet whispered. She's talking to staff in the front hall. Excitement warred with dread. Lily rushed to see Mrs. Bloom, only to spot her through a crack in a door. Miss Rowan was blocking Mrs. Bloom's way, arms folded. Mrs. Bloom looked upset, gesturing. Lily couldn't catch every word, but she heard fragments. At least let me speak with Lily. A misunderstanding. No, you can't just. The conversation ended with Miss Rowan stepping forward, glaring, and Mrs. Bloom being ushered out by staff. Lily's stomach sank. Had Miss Rowan discovered the camera? Mrs. Bloom disappeared through the doors. Lily felt crushing disappointment, certain everything had failed. She trudged back to her bunk, tears burning her eyes, feeling powerless. Night fell again, oppressive and quiet, each hour a torment. She couldn't sleep, imagining Matthew locked in some terrible place. If she had moved faster, if she had gotten the camera to the police herself. Just after midnight, a commotion rattled the orphanage. Lights splashed across the courtyard. Lily bolted upright, heart hammering. Shouts echoed from the halls, sharp voices commanding staff to stand aside. Harriet stirred, eyes wide with confusion. Lily jumped out of bed, her pulse frantic. She peered into the corridor, seeing uniformed figures streaming past. Was this it? The rescue? An authoritative female voice rose above the din. This is the police. We have a warrant to search these premises. Lily's entire body flooded with relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. She glimpsed a woman with a stern, confident bearing, presumably Officer Morgan, holding papers and flanked by uniformed officers. Miss Rowan tried to intercept them, but the police swept around her. Staff members either protested or cowered. Lily hardly dared believe it was real. She rushed into the hallway, Harriet behind her. They're here, Lily breathed, tears of gratitude welling. They're finally here. Officer Morgan caught sight of Lily. You, she said firmly, are you Lily Thompson? Lily nodded, unable to speak. Stay close, child. We're here to investigate the allegations. Mrs. Bloom showed us your photographs. Her tone conveyed both urgency and reassurance. Miss Rowan attempted to maintain composure. Officer, this is an outrage. We run a respectable institution. Whatever pictures Mrs. Bloom provided must be fabricated. Officer Morgan's gaze hardened. We'll see about that. Step aside. She motioned for her team to follow Lily's directions to the basement. Lily led them down the corridor, pointing out the locked door. Police forced it open with a pry bar. The metal door squealed in protest, revealing that same small lab-like room. Officer Morgan's eyes narrowed at the sight of the cots with restraints, the medical supplies, the stacked files. Within moments, more officers discovered a hidden annex behind a heavy curtain. Lily and Harriet peered around the swarm of police, heart pounding. In that annex, multiple children were found behind a locked gate, trembling with fear. And there, among them, was Matthew, eyes red from crying. Lily stifled a sob, pushing forward to reach him, but an officer gently held her back until they unlatched the gate. Then Matthew stumbled out, clinging to Lily as though she were a lifeline. "They said I was next," Matthew choked out, face pale. "They were going to move me tonight. I was so scared." "We're safe now," Lily whispered, tears streaming. "It's over." Officers took photographs, took statements. Miss Rowan, seething, claimed they were providing special care for troubled orphans, that the cots and medical equipment were for health screenings. But the files and the frantic children told a different story: recorded payments, client names, schedules of transfers. Mr. Denfield tried to slip away, but police caught him at the side door, briefcase in hand, stuffed with money and documents. The entire operation lay exposed under fluorescent lights. In a swirl of chaos, Lily saw Miss Rowan clapped in handcuffs, still protesting. "You fools don't understand," she shrieked. "These children would have no homes otherwise. We do them a favor, placing them with wealthy families." Her words faltered under the glare of Officer Morgan, who enumerated the charges: child trafficking, illegal confinement, conspiracy. Staff members who assisted or turned a blind eye were likewise arrested or detained for questioning. Children from dorms throughout Rosewood converged in the main hall, frightened and exhausted, but also inexplicably relieved. Paramedics tended to those who were malnourished or bruised. Matthew refused to let go of Lily's hand. Harriet hovered close, tears shining in her eyes. Mrs. Bloom arrived, pushing through the throng, tears brimming as she spotted Lily. "You did it," she whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "Officer Morgan believed me after seeing those photos." "Oh, Lily, thank goodness you're all right." Lily nodded, words catching in her throat. She could only hug Mrs. Bloom, tears streaking her cheeks. The night air wafted through the open doors as more children were led outside to waiting police vans or ambulances. Lily stared at the once imposing facade of Rosewood, now bright with flashing red and blue lights. It seemed smaller, less terrifying, laid bare by the truth. By dawn, Rosewood Orphanage was empty of children. They were transported to a safe facility or placed in temporary care while the legal process began. Lily found herself wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance. Mrs. Bloom stood beside her, offering a cup of warm tea. Lily sipped, hands shaking from the emotional toll. She glimpsed Harriet, Matthew, and a few others being comforted by social workers. Officer Morgan approached. "Thank you for your bravery, Lily," she said. "Without your evidence, this might never have come to light. You saved a lot of kids." Lily swallowed, tears welling again. I just did what I had to," she managed. "What about Miss Rowan?" "She'll face charges," Officer Morgan replied grimly. "Same with Mr. Denfield and any staff who participated. They won't hurt anyone again." The dawn sky lightened to a pale blue as the last police vehicle pulled away from Rosewood's gates. Lily gazed at the building, its tall spires and shuttered windows now exposed for the prison it truly was. The horror of the place still weighed on her. She thought of Amelia, the older girl who'd first disappeared, and the many others who'd never returned. She prayed they'd be found and rescued someday, now that the trafficking ring was busted wide open. In the days that followed, Lily struggled to adjust. She was placed in a temporary children's shelter while authorities sorted out the orphanage fiasco. She answered questions from investigators, recounted everything she saw, every note she made in her battered notebook. The trauma still clung to her. She woke at night, dreaming of footsteps in the hall, locked doors, and the screams of children. But each morning she reminded herself it was over. Rosewood's darkness had been exposed. Matthew ended up in the same shelter, and Harriet too. They spent quiet hours together, talking about normal things, favorite foods, silly jokes, anything to distract from the memories. Lily learned that the police had discovered references to older transfers and were now searching for leads on children sold or trafficked beyond the state. It made Lily shudder at the scope of Miss Rowan's cruelty. A week later, Mrs. Bloom visited Lily at the shelter, bearing a small bouquet of flowers. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Lily shrugged. "I'm okay. Sometimes I still feel like I'm in that basement." Mrs. Bloom's eyes watered with sympathy. She sat beside Lily, taking her hand. "It'll take time to heal," she said softly. "But you have a bright future ahead. You're free now, Lily." A pang rose in Lily's chest. She had no family, no home besides what the state provided. "I don't know where I'll go," she murmured. "Will another orphanage take me? What if it's just as bad?" Mrs. Bloom placed a reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder. "Not all orphanages are like Rosewood," she said. "But if you'd like, I could foster you. Or in time, adopt you. Only if you want, of course. I know we barely know each other, but—" Tears welled in Lily's eyes, gratitude and relief spilling over. "Really?" she whispered. "You would?" Mrs. Bloom nodded, her own eyes misty. "Yes, Lily. You're an incredible girl. Brave. I want to give you a safe place, a home. If that's what you want." Lily flung her arms around Mrs. Bloom, tears streaming. She thought of her mother, how she once believed no one would ever replace that love. But Mrs. Bloom's kindness glowed with genuine warmth. "Thank you," Lily sobbed into the woman's shoulder. "Yes, I want that." Their arrangement took time, paperwork, background checks. Meanwhile, Lily testified in preliminary hearings against Miss Rowan and her cohorts. The photographs she took played a pivotal role in building the case. Journalists latched onto the story. "Orphanage of Horrors Exposed," the headlines read. Lily tried to tune out the sensational coverage, focusing instead on day-to-day healing. She attended therapy sessions arranged by Child Services, slowly sorting through her trauma. Officer Morgan occasionally checked in on her, updating Lily on the ongoing investigation. They'd found partial evidence that some children had been sent out of the country, though leads were scattered. Lily's heart twisted each time she imagined those poor children. She could only hope that, as more details surfaced, more rescues would follow. For Harriet, the transition was rocky. She'd been at Rosewood for years, knew no other life. The memories haunted her. But Lily was determined to stay in touch, comforting her friend. Matthew, too, struggled. He'd narrowly escaped a transvestite. Over time, they all found support in each other, forging a bond born of shared trials. As the legal proceedings drew on, Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield publicly claimed they'd been running a charitable operation for difficult orphans, but prosecutors dismantled their defense. The files Lily captured, combined with the living testimonies of rescued children, revealed a profit-driven trafficking ring. The orphanage's public facade shattered into a million pieces. Months passed. Lily settled into Mrs. Bloom's cozy cottage, a small, sunlit place with a well-tended garden. Each morning, she woke to the aroma of fresh coffee and the gentle hum of the radio. A spare bedroom had been decorated just for her, complete with a desk where she could do her new school homework. She started at a local elementary, feeling shy at first, but gradually making a few friends. It was an unremarkable, pleasant routine, exactly what Lily needed after Rosewood's terror. Her nightmares lingered. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she'd jerk awake, convinced she heard Miss Rowan's footsteps or glimpsed the flicker of basement lights. When that happened, she found comfort in the soft glow of the nightlight Mrs. Bloom placed in her room, or in Mrs. Bloom's gentle presence if she tiptoed into the living room. Over cups of warm milk, Mrs. Bloom would tell Lily that it was all behind her, that she was safe now. Lily would nod, tears in her eyes, wanting so desperately to believe it. Eventually, the trial date arrived. Lily, Harriet, and a few other older kids were called to testify against Miss Rowan. The idea of facing that woman in court terrified Lily. On the day she was to give her testimony, Lily sat in a waiting room inside the courthouse, heart-thumping, images of Rosewood swirling in her mind. Mrs. Bloom held her hand, whispering words of encouragement. When Lily's turn came, she stood before the judge, voice quavering at first, recounting how she discovered the files labeled transferred, how she took photos of the basement's medical equipment, how Miss Rowan threatened her. Miss Rowan sat at the defense table, eyes burning with silent fury. Lily forced herself not to shrink under that glare. She told the truth, every detail. By the time she finished, her cheeks were hot, tears threatening to spill. The prosecutor thanked Lily, praising her bravery. Miss Rowan's defense tried to discredit her, claiming Lily was a troubled orphan with an overactive imagination, but the photographic evidence spoke for itself. Plus, Harriet's and Matthew's testimonies corroborated Lily's account. The more the defense pressed, the more consistent Lily's story appeared. After stepping down from the witness stand, Lily felt shaky but also oddly liberated. She clung to Mrs. Bloom's arm, relieved that she had finally confronted the woman who orchestrated so much evil. Harriet testified next, trembling but resolute. After hearing Harriet break down in tears over the night she watched a friend dragged away, even the stoniest watchers in the courtroom seemed shaken. The trial lasted weeks. But in the end, Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield were convicted on multiple counts: human trafficking, conspiracy, child endangerment, and more. Their sentencing was severe, decades in prison, ensuring they would never run another so-called orphanage. The community reeled with disbelief that such a nightmare had lurked behind Rosewood's respectable veneer. Donations to legitimate child protection charities soared, as if neighbors wanted to atone for not noticing earlier. With justice served, Lily took her first deep breath of freedom, though she knew not every transferred child had been found. Some might remain lost in the system. Still, the biggest threat was neutralized, and the authorities promised to keep searching. Lily felt a quiet sense of triumph tempered by the sorrow of those still missing. In the aftermath, Lily grew closer to Harriet and Matthew. Harriet ended up in a good foster family not far away, while Matthew was eventually adopted by a couple who adored him. They all kept in contact, occasionally meeting at the park or library, forging a supportive circle. The horrors they'd lived through bound them in a way few others could understand. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mrs. Bloom sat Lily down at the kitchen table, a stack of papers before her. "Lily," she said gently, "I've spoken with your caseworker. They've approved my request to adopt you, if that's what you want." Lily's eyes brimmed with tears. "Really?" she asked, voice trembling with hope and disbelief. You'd be my mom?" Mrs. Bloom nodded, tears shining in her own eyes. "If you'll have me." Emotion welled in Lily's chest. She thought of her birth mother, lost to illness, and the emptiness she'd carried since. Yet here was a new chance at family. She threw her arms around Mrs. Bloom. "Yes," she whispered, crying softly. "I want that so much." So, Lily began a new chapter as Lily Bloom Thompson. The court finalized the adoption in a small ceremony, with Harriet and Matthew attending to celebrate. On the steps of the courthouse, Lily clutched her official paperwork, heart fluttering with gratitude. She gazed at Mrs. Bloom, who gave her a proud smile, tears glistening. Lily realized life could indeed rebuild from the ashes of tragedy. In the months that followed, Lily found happiness in daily routines. She walked to school with new friends, fed Mrs. Bloom's tabby cat in the mornings, tried her hand at gardening. When nightmares struck, she wrote them down in her old battered notebook, then wrote a page about something good that happened that day. Over time, the pages of hope outnumbered those of fear. Matthew and Harriet blossomed too. Harriet joined a choir at her new foster home, discovering a love for singing. Matthew devoted himself to drawing, filling sketchbooks with bright images that reminded him of freedom. They visited Lily, or Lily visited them, forming a kind of patchwork family who had survived unimaginable darkness and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. Eventually, Officer Morgan stopped by for a friendly visit, proud to see how Lily thrived. "You've got a future as a detective," she joked. "Or a journalist. The world needs people who won't be silenced in the face of injustice." Lily blushed, smiling. "I just did what anyone would," she said. But Officer Morgan shook her head. "Not anyone, Lily. It takes courage." Lily reflected on the dozens of children rescued from Rosewood, on the faces of those who might never be fully accounted for. She understood that her small acts, jotting notes, sneaking photos, had real impact. The orphanage's vile ring was dismantled, and for every child who regained freedom, Lily felt a piece of her own soul restored. As the seasons turned, Rosewood Orphanage itself was shuttered and put up for sale. Rumors floated that it would be torn down, the land repurposed for a park or community center. Lily visited the site once with Mrs. Bloom, standing at the gates that once towered with menace. The building looked abandoned, windows boarded, the yard overgrown. Lily shivered. Memories flickered of that first day, her fear and heartbreak. She clutched Mrs. Bloom's hand, whispering goodbye to the ghosts of that place. She didn't want to see it again. Time flowed onward. Lily turned 11, celebrating with Harriet and Matthew at a small party Mrs. Bloom threw in the backyard. They joked, ate cake, and played silly games. In quiet moments, Lily felt the scars of Rosewood ache, but the love around her soothed the pain. She told Harriet once, "I still have nightmares, but they don't control me anymore. I'm safe." Harriet, hugging her, replied softly, "Me too. We just have to keep reminding ourselves." Matthew chipped in, "Together, we're stronger than anything Rosewood ever did." They all agreed, clinking glasses of lemonade in a vow of friendship. After the party, Lily opened a gift from Mrs. Bloom, a brand new journal, pages crisp and waiting for her thoughts. On the first page, Mrs. Bloom had written, "To Lily, may your words bring hope, both to you and to others." Lily smiled through grateful tears, hugging the journal to her chest. Eventually, Lily overcame her hesitance to share her story with the wider world. She participated in a local fundraiser for child protection, standing on a small stage, voice shaking as she explained how she once uncovered the secrets of Rosewood. The audience listened, rapt, many blinking back tears. Through her fear, Lily discovered a new kind of strength, turning tragedy into advocacy. At home, life felt peaceful. She cherished simple pleasures, gardening with Mrs. Bloom, reading by the fire on chilly evenings, taking the cat for comedic attempts at walks. She grew in confidence, stepping into the role of a normal kid who occasionally remembered she had done something extraordinary. The nightmares faded to faint echoes. More often, she dreamed of bright skies and open roads. Occasionally, Lily heard news updates about the ongoing search for certain missing children. The knowledge that not everyone had been saved weighed on her. But each time another child was found, safe and alive, Lily felt a surge of joy. The police assured her that without her evidence, they might not have known where to start. Lily hoped Amelia, that older girl who first disappeared, had been located or would be soon. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lily rummaged through her old battered suitcase. She found the photograph of her mother, the corners frayed. She gently stroked the image, murmuring, "Mom, I'm okay now. I have a home. I wish you could see it. I wish you could see how Mrs. Bloom takes care of me, how she's basically adopted me. I wish you were here." Tears prickled, but they were warm tears, not the hollow grief she once felt. She closed her eyes, imagining her mother's gentle voice saying, "I'm proud of you." She decided to place the photo in a frame on her new desk, a small symbol of how the past and present coexisted. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bloom planned a weekend trip for them, a brief visit to the seaside. Lily had never seen the ocean, only read about it in stories. The day they left, Lily could hardly contain her excitement, pressing her face to the car window, enthralled by the rolling fields and the bright horizon. The ocean air smelled of salt and freedom, a tang that made her heart soar. On a quiet stretch of beach, Lily and Mrs. Bloom walked barefoot in the surf, waves lapping their ankles. Seagulls cried overhead. Lily felt the breeze tangle her hair, tasted the brine on her lips. She realized how rarely she'd felt such simple joy. "I never thought I'd see this," she said softly. Back at Rosewood, it felt like we were locked in a gray world with no end. Mrs. Bloom smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You deserve every happiness, Lily," she said. "Life can be beautiful, no matter how dark it once was." They watched the sunset turn the sky into a canvas of gold and pink. Lily breathed in the moment, feeling how far she'd come. She recalled crouching in that terrifying basement, snapping photos in the darkness, heart galloping with fear. Now, she stood on an open shore, free to run in any direction. She felt unstoppable, a phoenix rising from ashes. By winter, Lily had fully integrated into her new school. She invited Harriet over for study sessions, and Harriet marveled at how cozy Mrs. Bloom's house was. They sipped hot chocolate, giggling over silly songs on the radio. Harriet confided she hoped to join a drama club. Lily encouraged her, saying she had a great voice. Each encouraging word they exchanged felt like a triumph over the silencing fear that once ruled them. The days took on a gentle rhythm, interspersed with therapy appointments that helped Lily process her lingering trauma. She found the strength to talk openly about Rosewood, about how it felt to see kids transferred, about the guilt that she couldn't save everyone. The therapist reminded her that she was only a child then, and that she'd done more than most adults ever could. Over time, Lily believed it. Self-blame yielded to a calm acceptance that she had done her best. In spring, the trial's final sentences came down. Miss Rowan and Mr. Denfield received lengthy prison terms, decades, ensuring they'd never harm another child. Lily, Harriet, and Matthew attended the final hearing, each holding onto the other's hands in the back of the courtroom. When the judge read out the verdict, a hush fell. Lily closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she'd held for too long. Relief washed over her like a cleansing rain. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Lily, dwarfed by their microphones, felt overwhelmed. But Harriet and Matthew shielded her from the brunt of the attention, and Mrs. Bloom swiftly guided them away. Lily felt a quiet sense of closure, an end to a dark chapter. She'd no longer have to fear Miss Rowan's shadow in her nightmares. Instead, she could focus on living. To celebrate, Mrs. Bloom took Lily to a small cafe for ice cream sundaes. Harriet and Matthew came, too, along with Harriet's foster parents and Matthew's new adoptive mom. They all squeezed around a corner booth, chattering happily. For a moment, Lily's gaze swept over the group, and she realized they were a patchwork family formed from heartbreak and rescue. She spooned melted ice cream, smiling at Harriet's silly jokes and Matthew's excited talk about a new dog at his house. Warmth flooded Lily's heart. They'd earned this happiness, all of them. One day, Lily found a letter in the mailbox with no return address. Inside was a brief note from a name she recognized, Amelia. Lily gasped, reading the trembling handwriting describing how Amelia was found in another state by authorities pursuing the Rosewood leads. Amelia was safe now, in therapy, trying to piece her life together. She thanked Lily for exposing the orphanage. "You saved my life," the note read. Lily wept tears of relief, cherishing the news as proof that not all was lost. Time slipped by, and Lily's life turned almost ordinary: chores, school projects, birthday parties. She grew confident and bright, no longer the trembling newcomer who arrived at Rosewood. She still wore the scars, invisible though they were, but they served as reminders of her strength rather than weights of fear. One summer evening, Lily and Mrs. Bloom took a walk by the riverside. Fireflies blinked among the reeds, and the water shimmered beneath a silver moon. They strolled in companionable silence, the rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot. Lily had her battered notebook tucked under her arm, half filled with new writing, stories, poems, reflections on her journey. She was no longer afraid of someone snatching it away. After a while, Mrs. Bloom said quietly, "You know, Lily, I've never been more proud of anyone. When I think about all you endured, all you did, it humbles me." Lily glanced up at her, a tender ache in her chest. "I'm proud too," she admitted softly. "Sometimes I think about those I couldn't save, but then I remember that every child the police freed might have ended up worse. We made a difference." Mrs. Bloom nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, you did." They paused near a bench, watching the moonlight dance on the water. Lily whispered, "I miss my mother, but I'm thankful you're here. I feel like I have a second chance." A tear slipped down Mrs. Bloom's cheek. "I love you, Lily," she said, "and I promise you'll always have a home with me." They embraced, the hush of the river enveloping them. In that moment, Lily felt a profound sense of peace. The darkness of Rosewood still echoed in her memories, but it no longer controlled her. She had found a family in Mrs. Bloom, a support network in Harriet and Matthew, and justice through the unstoppable tide of truth. Though the tragedy of Rosewood would always remain a part of Lily's story, it was now a chapter she could look back on with resolve and say, never again. She took one last look at the moonlit river, inhaling the sweet night air, and let a slow smile curve her lips. She was free. She was loved. She was determined to forge a future where no child would face nightmares like the ones she endured. When at last Lily and Mrs. Bloom turned back toward the cottage, Lily felt hopeful. She thought of all she might do, maybe become a social worker, or a detective, or a writer who exposed injustices. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing: she'd never be silent if she saw someone in peril. She'd raise her voice for those who had none, just as she'd done in those corridors at Rosewood. If you found this story of courage and uncovering hidden truths meaningful, we'd love to hear where you're watching from. If you believe the truth should always come to light, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.